So one mistake that I often see in a lot of players, including my students, is playing an opening and try to learn an opening before you really understand what even happens in the first like two moves. So that may be surprising because you might think that in the first two moves we're just choosing what defines the opening, but the ideas are kind of way later on. Maybe in move 10 or something where you reach a certain position, where you reach a certain tabia, let's say. But actually, I think that a lot of players are missing the fundamental base and understanding, even reaching to the point where you get the main position of the opening. So, for example, recently I had a lesson where I actually saw my student play d4. His opponent played the move d5, and then after pawn to c4, which is the Queen's Gambit. First off, of course, we need to look at the main move e6 here, the Queen's Gambit. We need to look at the Slav here, and also a lot of very common beginner mistake is this move knight f6, which it doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons, and it all stems from the base if we understand what this move e6 and c6 is designed to do. So we understand that with both of these moves, it defends the center pawn by advancing the pawn beside it, right? And so it makes sure that any recaptures would result in an equal exchange. Already from this position with the move pawn to c4, we can already see that what is white arguing? That white is sacrificing a pawn on c4 here, but the big point is after d takes c4, in principle, this gives up the center, right? But what white is arguing is that because you've given up the center, yes, you do win a pawn, but at some point I'm going to be able to win it back, either with the move knight f3 normally. This is typically useful to control the e5 square. Let's say knight f3, knight f6, and then pawn to e3, where you can simply win back the pawn. And we can see that black has given up the center, but they will get a very free development. Let's say after e6, bishop takes c4, and then normally they play the move c5. So even getting to this position, there's a lot of things to understand. First off, what is the big point of the Queen's Gambit declined? And what is the big problem of the Queen's Gambit declined? So yeah, if you don't know this basic question or the answer to this, then it's a real problem actually because you don't have a foundation of understanding about the middle game itself. So the move e6 is very solid because it defends the center and prepares quick development by playing the move knight f6, bishop e7, and castles. This is normally the basic idea of the Queen's Gambit, right? But what is the problem? The problem is that this bishop on c8 is actually a bad piece. And we understand this because of the pawn structure. The pawn on e6 and d5 actually blocking this bishop, similar to what happens in the French defense, right? In that this bishop becomes quite poor. Now, the reason that maybe the French defense has a better reputation for white is that in this sort of structure, it's kind of more difficult for this bishop to develop freely outside this pawn chain. And so black is going to have to get like really creative in the middle game to solve this problem, or create some dynamic opportunities to actually just make sure that this bishop being basically dead is compensated by their activity. So let's go back to the Queen's Gambit before, as we saw with pawn to c4. Why is knight f6 a mistake? It's because we need to understand that with both the moves e6 and c6 or dc4, they're all designed to prevent basically white from winning a pawn and developing the knight for free. Because as we understand, it goes back to like different openings that in the Scandinavian, this is considered not that good because white can immediately hit the queen with the tempo. So if we understand a couple of those principles, we understand that knight f6 actually doesn't do anything, and we can actually take the pawn to d5, where queen takes d5, similar to the Scandinavian, runs into knight c3, and then white will simply play e4 next. Let's say if they play queen d8, we can play e4 with a very nice position, right? With a very, very big center and no problems at all. We've gotten free advantage. And if we take with the knight here, then white again plays e4 and gets a big center basically for free, ensuring them that they have a big advantage, right? So essentially we understand that knight f6 is not a very common move because of these reasons, and it goes back to understanding that what are the options that black has in this sort of position, either e6, c6, or d takes e4, right? But after e6 again, as I mentioned, this bishop is a problem, and so white normally can play either the move knight c3 or knight f3. Let's say we go into one of the main lines with knight c3, and already from this position, you need to understand that where does the black pieces belong? And we understand that actually the black knight always develops to the f6 square so that it can control the center and also defend the central pawn. And in here, I just want to show one of the main variations of the Queen's Gambit decline after the move knight f6, is that white can actually take on d5. Of course, knight takes d5 is a possibility, but let's just look at the main move e takes d5, and then we get the position after bishop g5. This is the so-called exchange variation, and what is so dreaded about this position for black is that normal moves will actually give black like a bad position because of the main problem in black's position, which is this bishop on c8. At first, it seems like this bishop can actually go out so freely on this diagonal, right? Either f5 or g4. Normally if the knight is on f3, then black can even consider putting the bishop on g4. But the big problem here is that after, let's say, black defends a pawn in the center with c6, first off, why do they do that? It's because if you play a move like h6, kicking away the bishop, which would be nice, here, white can simply take the knight and force the queen to recapture on f6, where it will drop the d5 pawn, right? And that's a free pawn. So it shows that after bishop g5, black has to somehow defend the center, or just like break the pin with bishop e7. Both moves are fine, but let's say c6. And in this position, white can either play the move, white has a couple moves, but essentially let's look at the most natural move, e3, which is designed to prepare the development of this bishop to d3, right? Very logical development, and it controls this long diagonal where it can aim at the black king if they decide to castle there. Now, the reason that the move bishop f5, which should be ideal, in a lot of scenarios, just to take control of this diagonal, a lot of people don't like this position as black because white has the concrete and a very strong response, queen f3. And after attacking the bishop, so the bishop comes back to g6. And then now we can take on f6, forcing either black to take with a g-pawn, where their pawn structure is completely ruined and they basically have a very bad middle game because the queens are still on the board, meaning that the black king really struggles to find a safe outpost. While if they take with a queen, which is the main move, and takes, they've basically accepted these doubled pawns, and from this position there are many moves that can go forward, but concretely, black is fine. And we know this because of chess theory, right? But if we look at it from an abstract point of view, these are kind of like a big problem, right? And the question is if white has enough to win this position. And objectively they don't, but it's quite unpleasant for a lot of people to face if they don't know how to deal with this imbalance. So instead of the move bishop f5, black can play the move bishop e7, and white now develops a bishop to d3. Because if you play a move like knight f3, then black is perfectly equal after the move bishop f5, because they developed the bishop on this long diagonal and they're able to exchange white's powerful bishop that would have aimed at the black king if this sort of exchange would have happened. Okay, so that's a basic point that we need to understand. And from this position, already actually after this exchange, we need to understand that this, with the pawn on c6 and pawn on e3, this structure is called the Carlsbad pawn structure. Now it's because black has four pawns on the queen side here, so they have a majority, while white has only 2 pawns on this side of the board, right? And so this means that there are a couple of ideas related to this pawn structure, which you can, really analyze and study in depth by many good resources. One of them being Grandmaster Sundberg Hansen in his YouTube channel, where he really highlights this pawn structure and the importance of this. And the thing about this pawn structure is that if black doesn't know what they're doing, then, for example, let's say they play the move bishop e7, bishop d3, now preventing bishop f5, right? So this is the point, is that if, let's say, you play a move like h3, bishop f5, and queen f3, it doesn't really do anything because this knight on f6 is already defended by the bishop, right? So you see that we have to understand every single point of these individual moves. And after, let's say, bishop d3, preventing bishop f5, black and castle, let's say, this looks very natural, and the white plays the move queen c2, threatening now to potentially take the knight and then take the h7 pawn. So let's say black develops with a move like h6, maybe kicking away the bishop and getting the pawn out of danger. Bishop goes to h4, and then let's say they play the natural looking move bishop e6. This looks natural enough because, let's say you play knight bd7, which is a better move actually. It looks like that it blocks in this bishop on c8, right? But the question after bishop e6 is that yes, it is developed, but is it even a good square to develop to? And these are only the things that you know. Either you have a really good positional understanding, or you've seen this position before. Now, if you've seen this position before in the Carlsbad, then you understand that the bishop never belongs on e6, pretty much. Like, it always wants to go somewhere else. Now, there are some systems that are very playable for black, involving the bishop coming to e6. But the big point is that the bishop doesn't really want to stay there forever. The big idea is that oftentimes you want to exchange this bishop for this bishop, right? So how does that happen? Let's say after the move rook bishop, instead of, let's say, bishop e6, black plays the move rook e8. And again, you need to think about, what is this move designed to do? Now, this move is actually designed to prepare a certain idea, which is after knight f3, let's say, if you play this move, black wants to put the knight on the center of the board. And they want to challenge these bishops so that if now black exchanges, white can't simply take this pawn because this would be a fork, right? And the rook is actually very useful to defend the center and support this pawn. And so basically after this position, black is very, very happy, and they've basically equalized, because next move they can put the bishop to f5, they can bring the knight to d7, and maybe bring the knight to f6, where a lot of pieces will actually be developed and black has no problems here, right? And of course, white has different ideas. White has the typical idea, if you understand it, this Carlsbad is to do some sort of minority attack by pushing this one pawn, this lone pawn, up the board to try to attack the c6 pawn, right? And so if you understand that, then again, it really helps you to play the position without knowing too much theory, but just based on understanding. So basically the point of this video is just to explain that you need to really understand your openings and not try to memorize them like a machine, because that will not work and you will forget them. But it's very important to actually break it down in an abstract way and really understand each and every single move. Like also the move orders, it might seem complicated at first, like does black play bishop e7 now, or do they play c6 first? But you can understand that if you put the bishop on e7, then the bishop can no longer go on d6, right? So there's actually some systems that black can choose with, let's say, c6, e3, and then here now bishop d6, which is okay for black, and it's just another way to develop basically. But when you play the move bishop e7 first in this position, then you've taken away that opportunity, right? So now white can adjust their strategy based on that, based on now what positions is black gonna choose from now on. Okay, so basically that's just the big point of understanding each and every single move, and that will prevent you from making common mistakes, like this move knight f6, which is very common at the lower levels. So that's just one example. Another one is actually that I want to mention is already from this position, let's say the Sicilian, you need to understand that there are like a lot of moves that white can go for, but what is the big idea, right? Is that let's say after knight f3, let's enter one of the big positions. I'm gonna skip a couple moves here, but essentially we need to understand the point of every single move, right? What is d6 designed to do? It's actually designed to prevent the push e5, because black wants to develop with the move knight f6. Because if you play knight f6 here, white will push e5. Now this is called the Nimzovich Sicilian, and it doesn't have a good reputation. I actually made a video on that, even though I think it's quite useless because no one plays the Nimzovich Sicilian anyways. But either way, d6 is designed to control the e5 square, but you see that now this bishop doesn't develop on this diagonal, right? Unlike if you go for the Taimanov, where oftentimes this bishop can go on the long diagonal, right? So even on the second move, you need to understand the points of like different moves, even a6, knight c6, g6, what are the points and what are the downsides? But let's say d6 here, and the white plays d4. And already from d4, you can actually ask yourself, like, why would white exchange a center pawn for a side pawn? It doesn't make sense at first, which is why Bent Larsen actually didn't really like playing the move d4 in this sort of position. That's at least a story I've heard, that he didn't want to exchange a center pawn for a side pawn. But the big point is that in exchange for white removing their center pawn, they're actually getting a very active knight in the center of the board. So let's say black plays knight f6 here, attacking the pawn on e4. So this forces knight c3, right, to defend the pawn. I mean, you could play bishop d3, but the problem now is that it undefends the knight on d4. So black can challenge this knight and play knight c6, and white will have to either move the knight back, defend it with an awkward move like bishop e3, or play the move knight takes c6, and they're gonna have to move the same piece again. And this pawn structure is quite nice for black because they control the center d5 square. and basically, and also control the b5 square. So it's quite nice to have this pawn actually. This also opens up the b file for the rook, so black has no issues here. And so instead of bishop d3, white normally plays knight c3. So, you know, so again, you can go back all the way from the second move about why does black play knight f6? Why not play knight, like, you know, let's say a6 first, which is normal in the Najdorf variation, right? Now, the reason is that white can actually play the move c4, and they can get the so-called Maroczy bind, where they're controlling the d5 square and b5 square. So it prevents both of black's big ideas, which is to advance in the center with e6, d5, or even pawn to b5 next. So this is a really good position for white. And this is why the move knight f6 is designed to prevent this idea of going c4 and then knight c3. So now the knight is in front of the pawn, right? Which is not ideal, but of course the knight is quite nice here. And now after the move a6, let's just look at this position. This is called the Najdorf variation. Now a lot of people, even myself, like in the past, I used to like just gloss over this move and like think, oh, okay, that's just the Najdorf. So, you know, let's choose white's next move, and then let's try to understand the position. Because from this position, there are a lot of moves that white can play, you know, bishop e3, bishop g5, bishop e2, bishop c4, even queen f3, queen d3, a3, a4, h4, h3, like every single legal move here is like a possibility, basically. But actually, I think that it's important to notice what the move a6 is designed to do. Because here, the move a6 is what Grandmaster Daniel King would describe as a high-class waiting move. And it is designed to control the b5 square and be as flexible as possible. Because if you play the move g6, you're basically showing your cards that I want to put the bishop on this diagonal, and white understands that and can try to go for a quick attack. While the move a6 doesn't actually reveal anything yet, because this is a very useful move in general to control the b5 square, right? Also has future ideas of pushing maybe the pawn to b5, but it is actually like very well suited to prepare the move e5 next. Now, why is it preparing e5 next? Can't black play the move e5 now? They can, but they get into some problems after the move bishop b5 check, and this is a move that a lot of people miss. They forget that maybe some people play e5 and they think, okay, I'll just retreat the knight back to b3, and then my opponent will play a6, and they will transpose into, you know, into what I know. But actually, after, let's say, knight b3, maybe black can even consider playing a move like a5 and try to kick away the knight, you know, something like this even makes a lot of sense, but maybe just like castling first makes a lot of sense first. Yeah, I said first twice, my bad. But maybe black can castle first and then go for the move a5, trying to dislodge this knight on b3. So they basically save a move on this move a6, right? So that is why the move a6 is actually really nice to prevent that move. Because let's say after e5 and bishop b5 check, this is really awkward for black, because if they can't block with the knight on c6 because we will simply take twice. If they block with the bishop, then we can simply take the bishop. Queen takes d7 is the best move, and then even play the move knight d2. Even knight f5 here is possible, but knight d2 is very solid. And the point is that black has given up their bishop, their light squared bishop, which is very important to control this d5 square. And so white will actually do everything in their power to control this d5 square further. And the fight is essentially over this d5 square. Whenever, you know, let's say black, you know, we get this sort of position, whenever black pushes the pawn to e5, then they're giving up control over d5. And the fight will be over this square, right? And so a6 is actually designed to help black to play e5 without running into this check on bishop e5. But yeah, there are like a lot of moves that like you may like disregard at first because you think that, oh, these are just, you know, this is theory. This is the most common move. This is what should be played. But actually, it's very useful to for your chess, and if you ever deviate from theory, to understand the point of every single move, especially in the opening, like even in the first 10 moves. It's very important. And a lot of people do neglect that. And so that's just what I want to mention. I hope this was kind of useful, especially to those under like 1800. I think, yeah, it's a really large area that people can improve on, and quite quickly, because all you need to do is just read a book, or, you know, buy a chess course, watch someone like really explain every single move really well, and then you'll really understand it and you won't forget it, right? So hopefully this video was useful and somewhat entertaining. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.